Good morning. My name is Karen Kooni, and I am tremendously grateful for your presence here this morning, quite early on. I appreciate that you joined us despite various protests in the city against the Chilean uprising, for instance, and many other obligations. I am delighted to welcome you to the Vera List Center Forum 2019, dedicated to art as a political practice. We have dedicated at the Vera List Center 2 years to a focused and in-depth investigation of art as a political practice, and have developed a number of program initiatives around that provocation. I just like to briefly mention a seminar series called Freedom of Speech, a curriculum into 49 darknesses, that was instigated by Amar Kanwar, co-curated with Laura Rajkovic. We pursued this for a year and are now working on a publication. We've also done a number of programs, I should say, around philanthropy and institutional responsibility. We are working with 2 Vera List Center Art Fellows. One is Dean Erdman and is developing a project around illiberal Americanism. And the other fellow is Helena Kazan, who is doing a project on poetics of violence. And these are both long-term commissions. Dean will have a one-person show at Parsons opening in January, and Helena is producing a assembly, she calls it, in April here in New York City. I want to give you a little bit of background, if I may, and just take a couple of minutes to give you a sense of what the center does and how we arrived at this question of art as a political practice. And then I'll give you a survey or a little overview of what's happening today, and then we're actually going to begin the programming. Don't want to fail to immediately mention that we are part of the New School, and it's a delight to welcome you on behalf of the New School, but I'm also really particularly pleased to do so on behalf of Ariola Pira, who is the curator at the Vera List Center and has co-curated and co-organized all of what we've seen over the last few days and what we're seeing today. The Vera List Center is a scholarly research center and a public forum for the investigation of the intersection of art and politics. We structure our programs around biennial focus and research themes. 3 years ago, with the change of the US administration, we decided that the intersection of art and politics was no longer urgent enough, and we actually wanted to position art as a political practice with all the questions that raises. So in the programs I mentioned earlier, we raised questions such as, if art is politics then art? Is it a dance? Is it music? And those of you who were with us last night would say yes, who heard that amazing concert that was presented by Chimurenga. If art is politics, another question is, can it shift and affect the sites, practices and participants of political processes in ways that political and traditional forms of political engagement cannot? Positioned as a political practice, does art embrace values that transcend party politics? And how does art as politics implicate cultural and educational institutions in this new political order? Today, we have the opportunity to celebrate the finalists for the Jane Lombard Prize for Art and Social Justice, which is one of our key initiatives. These finalists, thanks to the generosity of Jane Lombard, have become the Jane Lombard Fellows. We were privileged to have them with us for about a week and tried to bring them together as a group, as the members of a vital and interesting and incredibly important international network of artists and policymakers and curators and writers, and to also allow them to explore the city in various ways. So we've had a number of receptions and visited museums, some artist studios, and we are hearing from them today. So I'm thrilled to have them with us and I thank them very much for being here. Just a word about the prize. The prize attempts to map this growing field of politically engaged artists that are working in various communities in various countries across the world. The Vera List Center works with a group of 20 nominators. They're the prize council members who are active in different parts of the world in different forms and different ways of engagement, either as members of certain institutions, as independent curators or writers. There are also some artists among the nominators, and together come up with a group of first 40, then 20 semi-finalists, and an international jury then appoints a group of finalists. What we're looking for with the prize is to identify projects that have successfully advanced social justice in their communities, that are testimony to bold, courageous, and fearless engagement with very difficult political questions, and that are also evidence of artistic excellence, which of course is a term that is never properly defined, and that's one of the beauties of it. The projects, the nominated projects, help us at the New School to fulfill our educational mission. So the goal is very much to bring faculty and students into this community, also help us make a final decision, then bring one of the projects, the recipient of the Jane Lombard Prize, to New York for an in-depth study of how a project actually works. It's important to maybe just add that the key question that we try to raise with the prize is not just identifying these or exemplary models, but also finding ways to talk about them here at a location that is usually very far removed from where the projects are located, different contexts, different politics, different cultural environment, and to really look very carefully at mechanisms of translation, of mediation, of curatorial strategies that allow us to develop some understanding of what is happening elsewhere and make that understanding relevant to us here. Enough about the context. As you may have heard, and maybe some of you joined us last night, the Jane Lombard Prize recipient for 2018-2020 is the Pan-African art and music collective Chimurenga, based in Cape Town, South Africa, but active throughout Africa in various different ways. And we'll hear about their practice in just a moment from Eriola. The Jane Lombard Fellows are with us in two sections today. So the morning session is dedicated to questions of archive, and Eriola will actually introduce that section. And the speakers will be Naine Terena de Jesus, who will be in conversation with Maria Thereza Alves, who is her nominator and the recipient of the previous Jane Lombard Prize for Art and Social Justice. And they are followed by a presentation by Jasmeen Patheja, who valiantly fought for a visa that she didn't receive in time. So we are presenting a TED talk that she gave, and then we'll have a conversation with Phoebe Tran, who is a former student at the New School in my class, and she was one of the students who voted for Jasmeen Patheja's project, and we'll talk about the project a little bit in conversation with myself. The first presentation will be conducted by Thomas Lax, who is a dear colleague of mine, former member of the advisory board of the Vera List Center, curator at MoMA, who was going to be the interlocutor with Chimurenga and is now the interlocutor with me, because regretfully Chimurenga were not able to join us this morning. They were here for 3 days, intensively programming the Path radio station in the Aronson Gallery, presenting a concert to 500 people yesterday, and just need to recuperate and gain their strength again. Then we'll have a lunch break, and at 2 o'clock we continue with the session dedicated to archive as political space. And in that, we will hear from Liz Johnson Artur, from Dar Jacir, and in the middle, Tiffany Chung will speak to us. At 4:30, we welcome Anne Stoller for a keynote lecture on the avant-garde and the archive. Detailed programs and biographies of all the speakers are in your golden booklet, so I urge you to refer to that throughout the day. And before I hand this microphone over to Ariola Peer, I just want to thank you again very much for coming. I also want to acknowledge a large team that made this event possible. Among them are Catherine Johnson, there is Corby Johnson, who is the Vera List Center Graduate Student Fellow in Art and International Affairs and visited Chimurenga in Cape Town, Heron Abate, Lucy Leiden, and numerous other people, among them the AV team here at the New School. With that, thank you all very much for coming, and Ariola, please take it from here.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you everyone for joining us on a Saturday morning. The question of the relationship between art and politics is not our question. The work we do is the answer. This is something that Antonia Jabe, the founder of the Pan-African Space Station and the leader of Chimurenga, said to me when I visited them in Cape Town this past June, in preparation for their upcoming, or now past, program here at the New School. I've thought about this often and hard in the months leading up to their presentation, and if you have a chance, starting at noon, the Pan-African Space Station over at the Aronson Galleries on Fifth Avenue will be open, and I encourage you to visit, although at this point it is no longer functioning as sort of a place where Chimurenga is broadcasting from, but is now going to be a reading room and a listening room of their archives and publishing materials, some of which we're laying out for you to have a chance to browse later or during the lunch break. And if you joined us over the past 3 days in the Aronson Gallery, where PASS landed to broadcast from, but even more so last night in Tishman Auditorium for Craig Harris's concert, Festock 77, I hope you got a sense of that work. And the political nature of convening a community of African American artists, activists, and intellectuals, all participants, and some inheritors of the legacy of Festock 77, the Second World Black and African Festival of Arts and Culture held in January to February of 1977 in Lagos, Nigeria. It was a convening of people. And I think all of the people that we'll hear from today, all of the projects, do exactly that. They convene their communities, they work in their communities, and through this very act of a participatory act, a performative act, sort of bring something that kind of operates in that space that we celebrate here at the Vera List Center of Art and Politics. Chimurenga was nominated for the Jane Lombard Prize by Natasha Ginwala, curator at the Gropius Bau Berlin, who couldn't be with us this morning, but whose essay is found in programs that I hope you've all received coming into the space, but some are also laid out there. Today we're pleased to have Thomas with us, who will kind of take us a little bit through Chimurenga's performative aspects of their practice and really the role that music plays in their work. The other project that we'll hear from this morning is Naine Terena de Jesus. Naine Terena de Jesus initiated and is run now by Indigenous people, Oráculo Comunicação, which responds to the multiple needs of its community with art and education, as well as legal advocacy, and by taking part in demonstrations and retomadas, the retaking of ancestral lands. Oráculo provides workshops on Augusta Boal's Theater of the Oppressed, as well as acting as a communications agency, focusing on broadening knowledge about Indigenous culture and making sure that this is transmitted on their terms and on their voice, in their voice. The project was nominated for this prize by Maria Thereza Alves, who is also a recipient of the prize, for the urgency with which it responds to the community's needs, such as Terena's current research into psychology due to the suicide attempts in her community. We're going to try to get Jasmeen over on Skype, but she's actually headed to the airport at 1:45. So we'll see how lucky we are in catching her in time before she's actually headed over to us here in New York. And if anyone would like to meet with her next week when she joins us, please reach out. Blank Noise was created by Jasmeen Patheja in Bangalore, India in 2003. The all-volunteer-based urban feminist collective originated in response to widespread female experiences of street harassment across the culture, across the country. It is run by Action Heroes, a network of volunteers from different age groups, gender and sexual orientation, and seeks to transform public attitudes towards sexual violence. The group uses various strategies, including staging public protests, advocating for legal mechanisms, and applying new technology to publicize offenses. Jasmeen's project, as Karen mentioned, was selected by students, but it was nominated for the prize by the New Delhi-based photographer Gauri Gill. And we'll hear from Karen and Phoebe Tran as part of this presentation, but also we'll play a TED Talk by Jasmeen when it's her turn. And I'll now invite Thomas to join us to speak more about Chimurenga's practice. Thank you.
And good morning wishes to you from myself, who I find myself now in this very fortunate situation, and I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. The situation to be in exchange with Thomas Lax, curator of performance art at MoMA, a dear colleague and a curator whose work I really admire very much. You've done a number of exhibitions at MoMA and before then at the Studio Museum. We have, as I mentioned, detailed biographies here in the program, but I just want to mention that you are currently working at MoMA on an exhibition called Just Above Midtown, the art collective, and the subtitle of the show is 1974 to the present. You've co-curated and co-organized and curated numerous exhibitions at MoMA, among them one-person presentations of Neil Balufa and also Stephanie Jameson's Promise Machines. You are on the board of Dance Space Project, teach at Wesleyan University, and on the advisory committee of Contemporary and the Laundromat Project, Participant Inc., and other organizations. And you're the recipient, I should mention that, of the Walter Hobbs Award for Curatorial Achievements. So delighted to be in exchange with you.
Thank you for having me, Karen. Can y'all hear us without this or no?
I think we need that, yeah, for the camera.
Perhaps they can the other one.
How about now? No? Still no? I think it's working now.
Okay.
Good morning. How are you all doing today? Yeah, bright and early, caffeinating.
So, Thomas, I mentioned in my introductory remarks just briefly that we, instead of having Chimurenga and the three participants who are in town for the forum speak about their practice, it would be lovely to hear from you some of the reflections and some of the questions that the work arise or prompts in you. And I will, fill in to the extent that I can, maybe speak also about the prize and the ambitions of the prize a bit more. And then if there is time, we would welcome your questions to us. Or to Chimurenga, we can pass them on.
Definitely. Thank you, Karen, for this invitation. I guess it seems to me that it makes sense to begin with the paradoxes of one person standing in for a collective, for me living here in New York, being a New Yorker, speaking on behalf of a group that's based in Cape Town, that kind of looks to the history of Pan-Africanism as something that I understand as yet to arrive, as a kind of horizon line. And in many ways, I think the formulation of the exhibition right now is something that we will go to attend, that we are in some ways having missed since the broadcast is over, but that is itself awaiting for a moment that also is anticipating. Feels like all echoes of this bizarre interval temporally that we're in. So I just wanted to start with the kind of contradictions and weirdness of that, which to me, I think feel actually in some ways symptomatic, perhaps, of the time signature in which I understand Chimurenga to be operating in, and also the location that Chimurenga is occupying. In other words, in the way that Chimurenga articulates what Africa is on the one hand not geopolitically located to the kind of state formations that exist of the countries on the continent, and yet at the same time, as they articulate it, exists in response to the lived conditions on the ground across the continent and its diasporas. And so I think that kind of tension feels like a super important one that has informed my own thinking about what the impossibility of making meaningful connection across time and space might be. And it seems that Festac, in the way that it's been framed in this beautiful recent book that Chimurenga has put out, as well as in the conversations leading up to today, it's been deployed as one example of how Africanness is an unstable yet necessary category in the work of Chimurenga. And I guess, yeah, to pose the question back to you, Karen, I'm curious if you can maybe, because how many folks were here on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday? Okay, so maybe like half the people in this room. So for the other half, maybe if you can just kind of bring us all up to speed of
Certainly.
What the past did, how Festac was related to it. I would love that.
So Chimurenga received the prize for the Pan-African Space Station. It's an itinerant radio station that pops up in different places and has done so over numerous years in different countries. And it is fed and anchored and tied and nourished by very, very specific relationships to the locale where it lands. And in that sense, spans a really interesting scale from the intimate, the personal, the incredibly emotional, and I guess intimate, to the large abstract notion of Pan-Africanism that is kind of floating in people's minds and active and incredibly powerful and seductive throughout the world. So this collapse of scale between intimacy, personal relationships, and larger philosophical concepts is really defining the PASS project. For us, as I mentioned in my introduction, for us and Chimurenga, the challenge was how do we bring PASS to New York at this moment in, to the New School? And the thinking evolved quite a bit, and eventually tied to Chimurenga's 5-year research into the history and legacy of Festac, we decided that PASS at the New School would focus exclusively on the repercussions and the resonances that Festac has now today in New York City. And in order to make that tangible and bring that out very clearly, Chimurenga organized 3 radio sessions. They were not publicized the way I usually like to publicize our programs. It was really done by word of mouth. And it was fascinating that despite numerous invitations from us to produce posters or books or ads, Chimurenga got back to us and said, actually, we'd like to produce these cards, and I think there's some over there. So these little handheld, paper-made cards, almost like baseball cards. We printed, I think, 2,000 or 3,000 of them, and they were distributed in various locales throughout the city, by hand, just spread throughout the city. They worked. And on Wednesday, for the first landing of PASS, which was dedicated to the Sandra Orchestra and the jazz history linking Sandra Orchestra to Festac, there were a number of members of the Sandra Orchestra that were participating in the radio session. One of them was Ahmed Abdullah, who is a professor here at the New School. Another person was Craig Harris, who is a trombonist and went to Festag in 1977 with Sun Ra. And another person, also a jazz faculty member here, Richard Harper, has been a teacher for Craig Harris, and Ahmed Abdul, and he was there too. So within those 3-4 hours in the gallery space, there was this extraordinary reconvening of musicians who had traveled together from the US, from New York City to Lagos, Nigeria. What is that, 38 years ago, to experience Pan-Africanism and Black culture making in Africa and through the Black diaspora. That was on Wednesday. On Thursday, the session was dedicated to Black women collectives, and the main interlocutor there was Harmony Holiday, not Holland, who invited a number of representatives of women collectives who had also gone to Lagos. And the speakers were Valerie Maynard, for instance, Charlotte Carr Richardson, and a number of other people. And Valerie spoke very beautifully about the in her case, most people stayed 4 weeks that she spent in Lagos. And she said they were just levitating the entire time. And it felt a little bit in the gallery that this was happening with this group of women talking about the legacy of Festag as well. Interesting in that particular session was also that the women who had gone to Lagos were so highly respected by younger artists, women artists, writers, and curators who were in the audience, clearly hadn't been to Festag, and the trans-generational conversation between these elders, in a certain sense, and the young, followers was really very, very moving. Then yesterday we had a session on Black photographers, and Calvin Reed and Marilyn Nance were there. That was also in the afternoon, and Chimurenga achieved this incredibly successful feast of having a conversation around photography and Black image making through a radio station. We in New York had the benefit of actually being in the gallery and seeing some of the work by Marilyn Nance presented to the gallery wall, but the radio listeners, of course, didn't. So those 3 sessions were key. Leading up to that was a visit by Ntone Ejabe in January to the New School, where he met with students and faculty and had various conversations also just with students. I mentioned, or Ayola was in Cape Town for a number of days. The student Corby Johnson was in Cape Town for 3 weeks. So the work has spread and embedded the New School in unexpected and deep and lasting ways, including last night where it was 12 singers from the New School for Jazz, students were participating in the concert.
I want to just stay for a second on the through line of music, which I promised I would kind of deliver as a curator of performance art, but I actually think perhaps there is something there that in my ears is a beautiful thread, which is the way in which this exhibition, which builds off of previous exhibitions that Chimurenga has organized, like the one that the Autolith group invited them to do at the Showroom Gallery in London, I think takes what is an assumption in music, which is that, what we are doing when we attend to art is to come together and to then exercise that in the space of a show, which this project does so beautifully. And I think Sun Ra in particular is such a emblematic figure of the way in which that space of assembly is not just one of feeling good, right? Obviously there's feeling good there too, hopefully, but also one, I think the way I understand why Ntone and Chimurenga came to pick Sun Ra is because of the schisms and antagonisms that in 1977 Sun Ra meant within the context of Festag. And I think you see that in Marilyn Nance's beautiful photos that she showed, and the ways in which there's a kind of group of people that are standing outside of the door of the rehearsal, and over the course of the series of images, you kind of see, desire to enter into that field. So the kind of skepticism turned into being inside of this chorus. But I also think you see it in the way that the terms of who could count as Black or as African are differently divided because of the kinds of experiments that Sun Ra is making. And I guess the reason I say that is to say, is to kind of put some terms or parameters around Africanness or Blackness as a kind of normative horizon line. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that I think what Chimurenga proposes is that Black is not enough, and that the terms in which Blackness is articulated are one, already internally differentiated and antagonistic, and two, as a horizon to approach, can be named more specifically. And I think in those moments of listening, of looking, of mediating collectively to create a kind of new narrative, that's what was produced. And I think in the work that I'm up to with my colleague Mari Ingram, who's working with me on the Just Above Midtown show, we've been thinking a lot about this space in New York City, Just Above Midtown, founded in 1974 by Linda Good Bryant, that was in operation into 1986, as one in which not only was Blackness named as a space for contestation, but also that was defining itself against the Black institutions, be they museums or commercial galleries at the time, to say that there's actually something more specific operating inside of this sphere. And that's one of the kind of similar shapes that I see between Chimurenga and the work of Just Above Midtown.
Maybe just briefly a comment on this extraordinary concert that we heard yesterday, and I'm delighted to see Greg Harris here in the audience. The concert was hosted by Chimurenga and consisted of a concert that Craig composed in 1981. It's titled Festdag 77 and inspired by Harris's trip and participation at Festdag. Was last performed in New York City in 1982, so hasn't been heard for many, many years. The performance was exuberant. There was 15 or 16 musicians, the 12 New School students singing, and it felt like it was really a moment that everyone had waited for to happen. There was a sense of anticipation and fulfillment and affirmation that one rarely experiences, and maybe more so in musical situations. But afterwards, I had a wonderful conversation with the drummers, and they said that Greg allowed them and gave them space in this composition to actually engage and commit and produce drumming that was informed by their Senegalese background. So the drumming section was Senegalese, it was not African American, and they praised Greg for allowing that particular individual sound to come through and occupy a space and not to be absorbed in this larger celebration of Festdag or notion of just Black jazz music. So the necessity to recognize the difference and provide space and time for them is certainly, I mean, it's true for curatorial practices, and I gather from music as well. I want to ask you, Thomas, a question about your experience and professional trajectory, working and starting, I believe, at the studio. I don't know whether it was your beginnings, but certainly a significant part of your recent professional career took place at the Studio Museum in Harlem. And maybe 5 years ago, you joined MoMA and moved from a culturally specific, defined organization to one that is anything but and has global aspirations. Could you talk a little bit about that transition, and maybe precisely in reflection of your comments earlier?
Sure, yeah, I think that something that I speak a lot to my friend Rujako Hockley, curator at the Whitney Museum, about. She, who also began her career at the Studio Museum in Harlem, went to the Brooklyn Museum, and then around the same time that I went to MoMA, went to the Whitney Museum, is the ways in which the Whitney Museum and MoMA are also culturally specific institutions, but perhaps are under less of a burden to name that specificity, and are equally, like the Studio Museum, global institutions. And that part of the challenge, differently so there than at MoMA, is to, one, parochialize the set of tastes and standards and belief practices in a place like MoMA, to name them for the kind of specificity and position that they hold, and then also to likewise acknowledge that a conversation around kind of Blackness is always already produced by a global experience. So I think a huge part of this transition has been around actually naming unlikely similarities, and I think that's been one. I think the second biggest thing is just the difficulty of building relationships under the conditions that we live, and also the pleasures and necessities of doing that. And I think at the Studio Museum, where I sat in an office with Naomi Beckwith, who you've invited to speak here for the annual lecture, who was this far away from me, and I could kind of scream, and we could just have this ongoing conversation. You can't quite have that in the offices that we work in, although we do a lot of screaming to make that happen. I think the stakes and possibilities for intimacy look different. But I think what I've been really lucky in our department in media and performance, because film and all of the histories of performance require collaboration, right? There's no way to make any kind of project happen, which is true of all art, but I think that there's a recognition of that in the histories of dance and music and theater, is that not only have I had a chance to work very closely with my colleagues in that department, Anna Yanevsky, Martha Joseph, Stuart Comer, but actually kind of make projects about those relationships, which isn't to say here are diaries to one another, read them, because I'm not assuming you guys care that much, but that we make shows that are about relationships and that are about, fundamentally, art comes from people being friends, fighting with each other, sleeping together, moving out of each other's apartments, and that all makes its way into the content of work or into the forms that artists then use. And so when we made this show, Anna, Martha, and myself, last year about Judson Dance Theater, we effectively tried to show how this group of people working in a local church were making works that emerged directly out of their relationships with one another, which I think is a way, similarly to this kind of parochializing of MoMA conversation, of naming these relationships as contingent and on the one hand productive and also limiting, but out of those constraints, creating something else.
We would love to also take any questions you might have about Thomas's practice, or
I have a question for you, Karen.
We certainly can't answer, on behalf of Chimurenga, but just please develop some questions. I have another one for you, though, Thomas, which is the question about the chorus, and it's an element that is so important in Chimurenga's practice, and I would imagine also be a significant element in precisely curating performative work. So could you speak a little bit about your thinking about the chorus in relationship to Chimurenga?
Yeah. So many different ways. Well, one is just in this beautiful book, looking at who Chimurenga is on the back, and Chimurenga is : and then a list of the chorus, right? So that even Intone kind of sitting here, not sitting here, is the kind of false representation of what it takes to do this work. I think the other piece is, I think the chorus allows also for, the dancer on the end to kind of kick really high and hit people in the face sometimes too, which is a really particular relationship. And that's one thing about Just Above Midtown, that it was not a collective. And we have a kind of soloist emerge in Linda Good Bryant as a figure who's a collaborator of ours in making this show. And I think the distinctions between soloist and chorus are impossible, at least within that specific moment that we're working, which is to say that Linda also is Dawood Bey, is also Howardina Pindell, is also David Hammonds, but is not. And I think that process of coming close and then moving further away, that relationship is the thing that not only makes the work possible, but also contextualizes the work in and of itself. If that's kind of abstract, that's kind of woo-woo. But what I think that there's actually a way of telling the history of modern art that's like through groups of people, assemblies of people in different times and different places. And you don't necessarily, I think to do the work of telling a new history of modernism, which is, I think what MoMA has been tasked to do, is to fundamentally question the role of individual authorship, which isn't to say to do away with it, but to name it across multiple figures, even in the making of one artwork, and that if there are to be not just the bad object isn't white men. Like I think that there's like so much discourse. Oh, not a lot of white men. It's like that's not actually. It's the access to authorship that is presumed under the umbrella and sign of whitehood and manhood that has to be actively contested, not done away with, but reconfigured. So I think that's the way that I understand the chorus as a kind of figure, an operational figure.
And I would say that's certainly, to some extent, what I observe in Chimurenga, with just the desire to amplify the voices of people who participate in these incredibly unique, precious moments when people really come together, and out of them come something like books or the Chimurenga Chronic, which is on display over there, or of course the radio broadcast. So always this clear awareness of the value of curating and bringing together a very specific collection of people and then sharing that through appropriate platforms.
And it's something I imagine that you have to contend with and kind of figure out, struggle over, even in this prize, right? Like how do you, I'm sure of the 40 nominated individuals, collectives, groups, probably all 40 of them could or should get the prize. So what is how do you understand the kind of work of the prize in this moment in terms of being able to further the kinds of engagements politically that you're believing in? Well,
as I said earlier, and really speaking about Chimurenga, I think the challenge is to create a meaningful experience where one is and where we produce it. So that's really here in New York City at the New School. And you are absolutely right. Almost all 40, but certainly 20 and the 6 finalists are here today, absolutely could and, develop practices that are incredibly important and worthy of many, many prizes. For us, ultimately, the decision is really one of trying to facilitate a meaningful engagement with one project. And that project, as I mentioned, this pass comes to the New School. We recreate it in some form. So the challenge is to provide an opportunity for learning, for sharing, for community building around a project that is often already past, that certainly took place elsewhere. So how can you activate it again? How can you remobilize histories, understandings around the project that are already defined, and make them accessible and open to a range of different publics? So there are wonderful and incredibly diverse student body here at the New School, but there's also, of course, the public and our networks of curators and artists and writers that we collaborate with on a daily matter.
Yeah, I think that's something that very much that we share and animates both of our work, is like thinking about every archival object, document, work in a collection as having this capacity to live again, which I think was modeled in the way that, you know, the archive was brought over the last couple of days, but also I think in this political moment I was thinking about art and politics being these kind of redundant terms that are different from one another at the same time. You know, and as the conversation around the restitution of art objects looted during warfare from the continent of Africa continues to be part of a broad conversation around the work of museums today, it seems like the kind of use of artworks is one that, in many ways, the institutions that we work for are catching up with other models for thinking about the many, many lives of things over time, if that makes sense. Yeah. I guess in the name of chorus, like, should we just kind of all talk together a little bit?
Thanks. This is really fascinating, and I had a lot of free association because I used to go listen to Sun Ra at Slugs in the late 60s. And what I was thinking of more than anything in terms of your comments about relationships was what connections might there have been between the early feminist movement and this group? Yes, because there are obviously a lot of women in the pictures.
The picture that you see right now here is a picture of the American delegation, or the North American delegation to Festac. This photograph, the one we just saw, was taken by Calvin Reid the day when this delegation arrived in Lagos and were assembled in some conference hall. So it's not representative of Chimurenga, it's just an image that they used in accessing the legacy of Festac.
Yeah, but I'm thinking about the black women activists that I knew in the late 60s, early 70s, especially in California around Angela Davis and Fania Davis, and the intersections between their concerns and the white women's feminist concerns. There was a lot of overlap, and I think there was a lot of misunderstanding, too. But I'm curious if you have any comments about that, further comments about what you took away from your research.
Yeah, I think that there are many artists who traveled to Festac, Faith Ringgold, Betty Starr, who in their own work at the time they were making it had an investment in thinking about the retentions. As Robert Ferris Thompson, who's an art historian who's attended Festac and wrote for this book, would describe the relationship between African cultural practices and African American cultural practices. What's ironic or tragic or full of possibility is the way in which those artists were encountering African culture in ethnographic museums, right? So like through forms of capture, looting and pillaging. And so what Festac offered was in many ways a different chance for a kind of encounter, which I think, in looking at the kind of work that was made afterwards, I think differently allowed ritual to name itself as something that is not necessarily repeating something that happened before in a kind of authentic or exact way, but is in every iteration of a ritual making it up anew. And I think looking at the work of somebody like Sengen Ngudi, who was very close to Betty Starr in that moment, the work she then makes in the 1980s where she uses ritual, and references to Africa, there's a kind of irony. And so she makes a work where she invents an African country called bulimia, and becomes the kind of state representative of that country. And so I think as I was talking before about some of the ways in which blackness and nationalism kind of don't leave room for women or feminist practice, that the chance to actually see certain rituals with your own eyes makes perhaps people as artists less, conscripted to believe in the truth of the thing that they've already seen mediated by a Western art museum. And so there's a kind of more space for the creative imagination to move.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks a lot. This is a question for Karen. I was struck by the title of this forum, If Art is Politics, and my logic went like this. I know from basic logic that if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. And I know from the whole history of museums and art and being an artist and in society that I make the assumption right off the bat that politics is art. It's an art form. So my question is, when you were going through the possible titles for this, why did you include the word if? Because I always assumed that if, therefore.
Mm-hmm.
Just
Precisely because it is a provocation and it is not an equation. So the assumption is that for our program for 2 years, we're testing that prompt. If we declare art as a political practice, what consequences does that have? What kind of artworks do we look at? What art groups do we invite? What does that mean for us as an organization? And all of a sudden, our responsibility, our accountability changes, our constituency changes, and we need to deliver based on a artistic or / political platform in very different ways, and have actually internally as an organization changed the way we work and operate and are governed even. So it's kind of put us to the test, to look more carefully at the political consequences of all of our practices. And it was really prompted by the not so recent change in the American administration, where it felt like everything mattered politically, or we needed to consider that everything does matter politically.
And if I may add,
the reason I was asking is because to myself, I wrote down that we can eliminate if and just say art is politics.
Yeah, but it's probably not.
Well, I guess I was in the room when Karen was kind of talking through this, and so what I remember from that moment, what I remember from that moment is that, often there are kind of two sides. What you said, art is politics, and then another side, art is not politics, and that often the response to one is the other, and that doesn't really get a conversation anywhere. And that to put this other term, if, proposes a third space where we can kind of not have to say art isn't politics, but we can begin to ask how specifically does art work politically? And by chopping off the sentence in the middle, it puts it back on the spectator or the person asking the question to say, then na. Like it's not a given, but it's a proposal to articulate and define.
You succeeded.
Okay, maybe if there's one more question, otherwise we will invite Naine Terena de Jesus and Maria Thereza Alves to join us here. Or
I just want to make
Vera, do you want to go
I
first?
just want to make one comment about art as politics. And your provocation to say if politics is art, because one of the things I said yesterday at the opening award ceremony was about the experience of Congressman Cummings' funeral yesterday, having been laid in state at the Capitol, first African American to have done so. And so, to me, that led me to think about politics is actually art, as they carried out that performance yesterday and what that meant. So I think if you transpose these words, it actually poses different questions and different imaginations. So following up on your suggestion of provocation as opposed to equation.
It's a question that either of you could answer, I guess, but it's a question around the relationship to like a sort of living embodied history relative to like the status of the document in both the work of Chimurenga, but also like your research into Just Above Midtown. I was struck because when you were like holding the book, one thing that really strikes me about the Festac book is that it is unpaginated. There are no page numbers, there are also no dates. And so it makes it actually kind of challenging, because I was picking sections to assign to students and like, wow, it's hard to create like a strict sense of chronological causality because of that, to be like this came before that and that came before that. And it makes what is a historical record or a document feel like it could be of the present, but it also makes the new commissioned text, right, like the historical text that you were mentioning, Thomas, look like it's part of a historical record in the past. So there's like something about like the status of like a historical record that a document assumes that Chimurenga refers to also in their publishing status that then also gets like a little scrambled, the time signature you were mentioning about certain things being like really present. And so I was just wondering if either or both of you would want to just talk a little bit more about like embodied living history, because like so much of this activation has been like the embodied repertoire of people's skills and performances and ongoing musical practices relative to something like a document, which I feel like is both in like the Chimurenga space station landing, but also just above Midtown coming up.
Maybe just very briefly, to me interesting is the differentiation between a document and an artifact. And the embodied document is one that provides the source material but can be re-articulated in different ways. So the book is indeed very interesting because there are some reproductions of newspaper clips, and as you pointed out, the new texts are typeset as if they were old texts, so it's very hard to read it. It is a recreation of historical material, but according to, in this case, Chimurenga's aesthetic prerogatives. So very different from the artifact that is the actual material relict of an existence.
And I think you've named the term so effectively in what you've just said, Janine. One particular example for the jam show, as we anticipate it, is how Sengen Ngudi, the artist I mentioned earlier, who made these pantyhose sculptures filled with sand, originally made them to be performed inside of. They're called RSVP, so that they actually enact a relationship through touch. But the ones that MoMA has acquired, one, cannot be touched, and two, were selected because they hadn't been touched since they were first made. And so I think the thing that we're up to is thinking about how some of the value assignments that are adhered in the categories and hierarchies of painting and sculpture, then on down, prevent the kind of imbrication and collapsing and folding of time that you're describing. And so we're getting ready to kind of go talk to the folks in conservation and our fellow colleagues to figure out how this thing can differently collapse some of the, original copy ideas that Karen is just describing. Come and touch it 2022.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. Am I speaking too low, or is it okay? It's good. Okay. So I nominated Naine Terena de Jesus because she represents the necessity of artists responding to their community and all this, at the same time always developing ways to better deal with our very rapid changing political situations that we as artists have to deal with. Naine is an artist, but she's also including being an artist, is a teacher, an organizer, an activist, and an active participant in Indigenous politics. I'm going to be speaking lower because this is being translated. I mean, slower because it's being translated, okay? I'm trying to follow the conversation to my right. Naine and I met during the preparation for my São Paulo Biennale work, A Possible Reversal of Missed Opportunities in 2016, which was, the work was a series of posters resulting from workshops in indigenous communities. I asked, there are no images of it, okay? I asked if Brazil was not such a racist country against indigenous people, and you could participate in a conference. You know, in Brazil, indigenous people are not invited to conferences. What would you be, and what would you speak on? What would it be, and what would you speak on? So we proposed unrealized conferences with indigenous speakers. And there were the posters also. Naine organized the participants for the workshop at her reservation, Limão Verde in Mato Grosso do Sul. The results became a poster displayed in the local, very racist town. And the poster was backdated. So the idea was once it went out in the streets, it had already happened, okay? And the idea was, of the work was, now indigenous people are part of the discourse. Oh, you missed that? Oh, that was that conference. Everybody participated in, you didn't get it? So that we could move on and discuss and think inclusively. Okay. I had been reading a lot about science fiction feminist writers just before that work. So I was trying to figure out, the situation is so stupid and how we can only go invent something beyond. No?
Bom dia. Meu nome é Naine Terena. Está sem áudio. Eu fico com essa.
Are you hearing me now? Okay.
Meu nome é Naine Terena.
My name is Naine Terena.
Eu sou de Mato Grosso, Brasil.
I'm from the state of Mato Grosso in Brazil.
O povo Terena é um dos 305 povos indígenas brasileiros.
The Terena people is one of the 350 indigenous people in Brazil.
Há mais de 10 anos eu atuo como artista, professora e militante do movimento indígena.
For more than 10 years, I work as activist, artist, and militant of the indigenous movement in Brazil.
E através desse trabalho que constituiu o que eu chamo de oráculo,
and through this work that I call oráculo,
a gente tem compartilhado com pessoas indígenas e não indígenas a filosofia de vida dos povos indígenas brasileiros.
We are sharing with indigenous and non-indigenous people the philosophy of indigenous culture.
Meus instrumentos de trabalho são os aprendizados acadêmicos e artísticos que eu adquiri junto com o nosso modo de vida.
My instruments of work are our traditional instruments and also the knowledge that I got from academia and that I can use in my work.
É importante dizer que nós estamos, indígenas brasileiros, conectados com esse pensamento e, por isso, utilizamos todas as áreas possíveis.
It's important to state that we, indigenous people, are connected through this instrument, and that's why we take advantage of the technology.
Sim. Eu vou mostrar o blog.
I'm going to show you guys the blog I've done.
Porque é mais fácil ver do que só falar.
Because it's easier to look than just to listen to me.
E praticamente ele é constituído de 3 partes.
It encompasses 3 parts.
Divididas nas áreas de artes, comunicação e formação.
It's divided into arts, education, and communication.
Ai, tá, o que está dando aqui? Eu estou clicando e ele está aparecendo nessa tela. Essa aqui é uma última obra que eu montei em São Paulo.
This is my last work of art that I put together in São Paulo.
Chama Prosperidade.
It's called Prosperity.
É uma reunião de sementes e livros decoloniais de autores não europeus.
I used seeds and also books of authors.
Decoloniais.
Authors European that tells about decolonization.
A nossa luta é por alimentos saudáveis.
Our struggle is for healthy food.
E que a gente possa ser ouvido, por isso os livros.
And that we can be listened.
São livros, a maioria de autores indígenas.
That's the reason for the books. Most of them have indigenous authors.
Aqui é uma instalação chamada Câmara de Segurança.
This is an exhibition, an installation called Security Camera.
Nela contém imagens que eu e o Theo fizemos durante as nossas idas ao movimento indígena em Brasília.
In those pictures, there are images that both Theo and me we made of indigenous demonstrations in Brazil's capital, Brasília.
Tem fotos e vídeos.
There are pictures and videos.
Deixa eu mostrar aqui também isso aqui.
Let me also show you guys.
Isso aqui é numa aldeia do nosso povo.
This is a village from our people, the Terena people.
Nós temos uma organização.
We have an organization
chamada Grande Assembleia Terena.
Called Big Terena Assembly.
Onde a gente discute anualmente nossos anseios.
Where we discuss every year our desires.
As mulheres terenas são muito atuantes nas políticas.
The Terena women are very active in politics.
Deixa eu voltar.
Let me go back.
Aqui no campo das matérias escritas.
Here in this part of written articles.
É o meu trabalho, é meu ganha-pão, não sei como que eu falo
It's
isso.
my main work, my breadwinner.
E ele sustenta as minhas idas ao movimento indígena, minha participação no movimento indígena.
And that's how
tá abrindo.
That's my paying job to go to the indigenous movements.
E uma dessas matérias que eu escrevi durante a Marcha das Margaridas.
And one of these articles that I wrote about, it's called the Margaridas March.
Nesse mês foi utilizado como argumento.
In this month, it was used as the motive.
Para abrir um inquérito, uma investigação.
To open an inquiry.
Sobre a poluição dos rios de Mato Grosso com agrotóxico.
An inquiry to discuss the pollution of rivers in the state of Mato Grosso.
Não abre, não está abrindo.
Sorry, it's not opening.
Pergunta para aqui, vamos ver.
Just a second.
Abriu uma aqui. Uma coisa que eu acho importante dizer.
Something that I think it's important to mention.
Que esse é um trabalho em que eu faço de maneira quase sempre voluntária ou através de editais que me inscrevo.
That those work I usually do them voluntarily or through public competitions that I apply for.
E aqui é o Sr. Isaac.
This is Sir Isaac.
Ancião, uma liderança da minha aldeia.
He is an elderly leadership of my village.
Meu mentor.
My mentor.
E esse ano eu consegui publicar o livro dele.
And that this year I managed to make his book to be published.
E todos os outros anciões querem ter um livro agora.
And now all the other elderly in our village wants also to have their books published.
Eu vou mostrar e vou falar. Eu não sei se está com áudio. A gente tira o áudio, tá?
I'm going to show and talk about. I'm not sure if there is audio in this video.
Isso aqui é um exemplo. Eu tirei.
I took the audio.
Oh, you took it off.
Isso. É um exercício de teatro
It's a theater exercise
com alunos que eu tenho numa pós-graduação. Eu sou doutora, eu não falei.
with students that I have in a grad course. I hold a doctorate degree. I forgot to mention this before.
É a reconstituição de uma retomada de terra e um embate com a polícia.
So these are my students. They are acting land retaken. Sorry. They are taking back their ancestors' land, and they are
Pode falar que eu vou deixar.
and they are acting the encounter with the police.
Esse menino mora na aldeia em que aconteceu o fato real.
This guy, he actually lives in the same village where the fight between the indigenous people and the police actually happened. So it's a true story.
Muitas vezes eu sonho o que eu vou fazer e convido pessoas para participarem disso.
Many times I actually dream about what I'm going to do about my projects, and after that I invite people and I invite my students to make it happen.
E no caso esse menino, ele é um jovem pajé, está sendo treinado para ser um pajé.
And here this guy, this young man, he's receiving entrainment to become a pajé, that it's an spiritual leader in our villages.
E por último eu vou mostrar aqui
And
o
lastly,
canal,
I'm going to show you guys my channel,
onde eu tenho uma parcela de tudo isso que a gente faz.
where I have just a sample of all the work that we do together.
Isso aqui é em Brasília.
This is in Brasilia.
Nossa arma são nossos cantos e danças.
Our instruments of battle are our dances
Essa pessoa aqui sou eu.
and our songs. I'm this person here in the floor.
E quem está filmando é o Theo.
Who is filming? It's Theo that it's over there.
Porque em Brasília, enquanto um filma, o outro corre.
Because in Brasilia, while one person makes the shootage, is filming, the other person is running.
E eu vou deixar eles sentirem um pouquinho.
I'm letting you guys feel how we feel.
Deixa eu colocar um outro. Eu vou colocar mais um.
I'm going to put another movie
Não temos muito tempo.
because we don't have so much time.
Então a obra é uma instalação artística que tem 4 pétalas e ela se desdobra em alguns elementos que a compõem, como as sementes e os livros. Quando a gente deixa algumas sementes expostas, também atende uma necessidade das pessoas de sentir aquilo e de até mesmo pensar em todo o processo de alimentação que a gente tem hoje no Brasil.
This is the installation where I put seeds and books together that was intended to make people think about a healthier nourishment, healthier food.
E aí, vou encerrar mostrando a câmera de segurança.
And now I'm going to wrap up to finish and show you the security camera.
Que talvez seja uma combinação do nosso ato político de arte.
That maybe it's putting together. It's a combination of our work between arts and politics.
Isso aqui é o que a gente chama de retomada, a polícia chegando até a área onde os indígenas estão.
This is what we called land retaken. This is the police arriving as in a land where the indigenous people are.
Eu vou pulando, tá? Só pra... Aqui em Brasília.
I'm going to skip some parts. This is in Brasília.
A gente nunca é convidado a entrar na Câmara dos Deputados.
We are never invited to go to the Congress.
E sempre somos confrontados pelos policiais.
And every time that we go in, we are confronted by the police.
Aqui a minha liderança me chamou para filmar esse momento na nossa aldeia.
In this movie, in this part, I was invited to make the footage to film my leadership, my village leadership, in their encounter with the police.
Aqui também é da série de Brasília.
This is also part of the Brasilia piece.
Essa mulher aqui no meio
This woman in the middle
chama-se Sônia Guajajara
is called Sônia Guajajara.
e foi candidata a presidente ano passado no Brasil, vice-presidente.
And last year she was a candidate for vice president in Brazil.
Isso aqui é o enterro da pessoa que a gente simulou lá no começo, aquele exercício de teatro.
Simulação?
Lembra o exercício que eu mostrei, a simulação? Foi a morte dessa pessoa.
And do you guys remember my simulation with my students? So this is the actual burial of someone who was shot.
Ele foi morto em confronto pela terra. Ele foi morto na luta pela terra. Ele é um homem terena.
He was a Terena man, and he was killed in the fight over their land.
Ele está fazendo uma saudação para ele, um canto de despedida.
This man is making a farewell song.
E fala isso, que ele está falando, que ele está prometendo que vai reconquistar as terras.
And he is saying that he will take the land back. He's promising that.
E que vai cuidar dos filhos de Uziel, né? Passou. Acho que é isso.
He promised that he's going to take the land back and to take care of their sons.
Deixa eu ver se tem mais alguma coisa.
Let me see if there is something else.
Acho que eu vou voltar só lá no blog para pegar uma imagem.
I'm going to go back to the blog and to show you an image.
Que é essa aqui.
It's this one.
Ela se chama, eu vou pegar lá de dentro. Quem roubou essas memórias?
This exhibition is called Who Stole Those Memories?
São chinelos que eu busquei na minha comunidade.
They are flip-flops that I took in my community
2014.
In 2014.
Na ocasião da Bienal, em que eu conheci Maria Thereza.
During the São Paulo Bienal, where I met Maria Thereza.
Esses chinelos foram performatizados para o público.
Those flip-flops were performed to the public.
Para que eles sentissem.
So they could feel.
Que eles pudessem calçar.
And they could put their feet in the flip-flops and feel.
Porque os chinelos representam as pessoas que foram abatidas.
Because
No
those
Brasil.
flip-flops, they represent the people that were killed in Brasília.
Mas também as memórias que vão embora.
But also the memories that go away, that disappear.
E acho que é isso. Só vou mostrar a imagem com a Maria Thereza e é isso.
And
Tem uma imagem aqui com a Maria Thereza.
I'm going to show a picture of Maria Thereza and me, and that's the last thing.
Deixa eu ver onde está. Com os indígenas, aqui é na abertura da Bienal de São Paulo, onde os indígenas que nós reunimos junto a Maria puderam ver a obra.
This is in the São Paulo Bienal, where we gather indigenous people to actually go and see the exhibition.
E aí, só para encerrar, nossa atuação só tem poder e importância se a gente consegue fazer essa conexão.
And to finish, our work only has importance if we can actually make that connection.
Por isso é importante estar aqui com vocês.
That's why it's important to be here with all of you.
Obrigada.
Thank you.
So I'm going to ask a question to contextualize a bit better for a public in the U.S. Amazing work that Naine is doing, which the history here is different. So I'd like her to explain it a little bit better so you understand what she's up against when she's doing this work. And especially in the I'm talking about the documentation work, which you're one of the first Indigenous people documenting Indigenous struggles, or the first one.
Eu sou da área de comunicação, minha formação, sou graduada em comunicação social.
My area of study is communication. I have a degree on it.
Como profissional, eu trabalho com assessoria de imprensa.
As professionally, I work with assisting politics with their media.
E professora em cursos que trabalhem com comunicação ativista ou comunicação comunitária.
And I'm also a professor in courses that put together communication and activism.
E a partir dessa formação, eu construo matérias.
And because of this background, I make works.
Faço os registros como os que vocês puderam ver.
I registered happenings as you could see.
Temos hoje uma rede bastante grande de pessoas que escoam essas produções.
Nowadays we have a large group of people that publicize those works.
Veículos de comunicação nacional e internacional que acompanham.
National and international media that follow them.
E pessoas que colaboram, como o Theo, a Melissa, a Helena, que são pessoas que, quando a gente precisa, se reúne para produzir um grande conteúdo.
And people who collaborate with us, such as Theo, Helena,
e outras pessoas.
And other people that help us.
No Brasil, esse é um fenômeno em ascensão. Indígenas contando sua história.
In Brazil, this is something new, and it's becoming bigger. Indigenous people telling themselves their history.
I wanted to further contextualize the situation and ask, since when has the universities had a possibility, Indigenous students have a possibility to enter the universities, and about how many PhD student holders are there among the Terena?
Há alguns anos o Brasil iniciou
Some years ago, Brazil started
as políticas afirmativas
their affirmative actions,
e algumas universidades
and some universities
cursos específicos para indígenas.
started specific programs for indigenous.
Hoje essas ações estão um pouco abaladas.
Nowadays, those actions, they are a little bit weak,
Assim como todo o sistema de educação universitária do país.
as well as the whole educational system in the country.
Temos supressões de bolsas para pesquisa e permanência.
Research, the number of research recipients are diminishing,
E para os indígenas isso é ruim,
and that's bad for indigenous students,
porque muitos saem de suas aldeias para viver na cidade.
because many of them, they get out of their village and go to the city to study, and they need some financial support.
Entre os Terena temos, em média, hoje, 8 doutores.
In the Terena group, nowadays we have around eight people that hold PhD.
E isso parece pequeno, eu acho, para vocês.
And this may seem small for you,
Mas para nós é muito.
but for our group, it's large, it's big.
Temos mestres
We have masters,
e mestrandos,
students who have done a master's degree, who had finished, and other students who are doing a master's degree right now.
e a maioria dessas pessoas retornaram para trabalhar direta ou indiretamente com suas aldeias ou com o movimento.
And most of these students, once they finished their courses, they went back to their village to work directly or indirectly with their history.
Tem uma última coisa que eu queria mostrar. Será que tem tempo?
That's just one more thing that I want to show you guys. Do we have time for it?
Okay. I also wanted to further explain, because the U.S. situation is different, that the grants that are given for Indigenous students is, what I know, I don't know if it's across all the universities, but the ones I know, is one per department. So many students want to study education, health, or ecology, and that's only one per department, and everybody else has to end up studying, I don't know, processing, weird things that they don't want to study, in the hopes that sooner or later they can be able to get into their department. And the other question I wanted to ask was, when I became active in Indigenous politics in Brazil, there was no national Indigenous organization. There was the military government. There was much assassinations of Indigenous leaders and activists. And so I was living in New York, and I went to the International Indian Treaty Council, and I asked for them to teach me, how do you make a national Indian organization? And I was studying that, and then finally in 1980, I went down to speak with Marcel Tupai, who was my mentor, and I said, okay, I have some ideas. And he said, Maria Thereza, last month we founded a national organization. So I was a bit disappointed in what my future as a person would be. I was about 18 at the time, and I was very crushed. But then he said, do international. And I want to know, what is the development of Indigenous politics now? I know that the União Uni, which was the União Nacional Indígena, União de Nações Indígenas, the Union of Indigenous Nations, we had to get rid of that name because Brazilians were very upset with the word nation and indigenous together. But now, how has with the younger generation and within the political context of today, what is the indigenous politics that you must fight day to day?
Nesse momento,
In this moment,
tem uma comitiva de 10 indígenas
there is a group of 10 indigenous people
do movimento indígena organizado brasileiro
of the organized indigenous movement in Brazil,
fazendo visitas a países
visiting countries,
e dizendo o que a gente não quer.
telling what we do not want.
A gente, eu falo uma grande maioria,
By we, I mean a large minority
que rejeitam
that disguises
a mineração,
the mineration,
plantações do que a gente chama do grande agronegócio,
large farms of large agricultural farms,
e toda forma de violência contra os povos indígenas que nunca cessou no país.
and all the forms of violence against indigenous people that never ceased in the country.
Artistas indígenas também emergem,
Also, indigenous artists are becoming to the surface,
e através da sua produção tentam mostrar esse cenário.
and through their work try to show light into this situation.
E além de artistas, escritores e todos aqueles indivíduos que têm este mesmo pensamento.
And besides artists, writes, and everyone that has the same feeling about the situation.
E como pesquisadora, que sou de formação,
And as a researcher that I am because of my background,
eu estou estudando o que eu estou chamando de o quarto momento da política indigenista do Brasil.
I'm studying what I call the fourth moment of the indigenous moment in Brazil.
Mas isso não dá para falar agora aqui, porque a gente não tem tempo.
But unfortunately, I cannot talk about that here because we don't have so much time. Any questions?
Or is it, or you have also other religions? And also, and the next question is, do you have medical doctors, indigenous medical doctors?
Thank you so much for your presentation. I enjoyed it thoroughly. I also work with decolonial theory. I think your work is a phenomenal intervention because decolonial theory doesn't center the embodied women's experience, and I see women at the forefront of your work. So if you could speak more to that, I'd greatly appreciate that.
Take one more and then...
Thank you so much for this incredible presentation. Can you talk more about, in the rehearsal for with your students that you showed us, how the repatriation of land that you're working towards operates? Is it symbolic? Is it a preparation for an engagement with the state and with police? Or how does that process, given the ambivalent stakes of nationhood, articulate itself in the demands for sovereignty?
Maybe that's enough questions for now.
Sorry, can you repeat that question, please? You want to know if there is a relation between the theater of the oppressed and the actual experience?
How does the enactment that we saw make demands for the repatriation of land? Is it in a direct action to the state, or does it appeal to another cosmological order.
Se é uma relação direta com o acontecimento ou tem alguma ideia cosmológica? That's an abstract.
Bom, eu vou responder a ele primeiro.
I'm going to answer him
O Brasil
first.
tem hoje mais de 240 línguas indígenas.
Nowadays, Brazil has more than 240 indigenous languages.
Inclusive, a última imagem que eu não mostrei é um vídeo de um aplicativo que eu parei de desenvolver porque acabou o financiamento.
And an image that I couldn't show you, it's an app that I have created, but I had to start doing this because I ran out of grants, and it was an app about indigenous languages.
Para ensino da língua terena, o aplicativo.
To teach the Terena language.
Quanto à religião, indivíduos indígenas escolhem o que querem ter como religião.
As for religiosity, the indigenous individual, they choose what they want to understand or their religiosity.
E dessa forma não tem como falar que nós temos uma religião indígena, mas nós temos uma filosofia de vida. Eu acredito que engloba melhor.
So we cannot say that we have a religious, but we have an ideology. I think that translates better. An ideology and a philosophy.
E ele falou, eu acredito que pelo meu sobrenome Jesus é por parte de pai, que tem uma raiz negra, e aí tem uma história no Brasil sobre pessoas que levam o sobrenome Jesus.
And about my last name, it's Jesus. It comes from my father.
Que tem uma corrente negra.
And my father has a black background, so it's common to take the last name.
Feminismo e descolonização.
About feminism and decolonization.
Nós temos muitos autores indígenas.
We have many indigenous authors.
Tanto autores literários como acadêmicos que estão escrevendo artigos.
Both literary author and also academic that are doing articles.
E a palavra feminismo para as indígenas ainda não é uma palavra posta, existente.
And the word feminism for the indigenous women, it's not existent yet.
Porque tem idiomas que não têm essa palavra.
Because some languages don't have this word.
Eu gosto de feminino indígena, que vai entre o céu e a terra.
I like indigenous femininality, maybe, that goes between the land and the sky, instead of feminism.
E vou falar primeiro do exercício.
And I'm going to talk now about the exercise.
Ele é inspirado no teatro do oprimido.
It was inspired in the oppressed.
Isso.
The oppressed theater.
De Augusto Boal.
Of Augusto Boal.
Eu adaptei.
I adapted it.
Porque eu coloco algumas coisas que nos aproximam das cosmologias.
Because I put on it some things that make us closer to the cosmology.
Porque os trabalhos de corpo que eu faço.
Because the body works, the body movements that I make.
E na realidade tudo.
And in reality everything.
Eu preciso que vocês sintam.
I need you to feel it.
Sinestesia.
Synesthesia.
E após sentir, a gente conversa sobre o que aconteceu ali e o que acontece fora daquele mundo urbano, digamos assim.
And after you can feel it, we can discuss and talk about what happened in and outside of their context, of that context.
E após o exercício artístico, a gente faz o exercício político de pensar os futuros caminhos.
And after the exercise, we make a political exercise to think in the future routes. I'm not sure if I answered the questions.
Eu posso responder para ela de novo, porque na hora que ela falou, teve uma...
Can I answer your question again?
Uma das imagens
One of the images
traz uma montagem que eu fiz
shows a piece that I made
num evento do MST.
in the MST movement. It's a Brazilian movement of people without land,
Onde a gente levantou, através das notícias de imprensa,
where from news in the media,
que a violência contra a mulher no campo é quase invisível.
we throw light that the violence against women in the countryside, in the rural areas, is almost invisible.
E essas mulheres morrem e ninguém vê.
Those women die and nobody sees it. This one.
I had one. Sorry, there's just one thing because I remember that you mentioned about this article about the water and on the skin and problems with this. Maybe to end it, you can mention what was the result of that article you published as a journalist.
Tá. Esse artigo começou de um desejo que eu tinha de ir para Brasília.
This article that I'm going to talk about, the idea of it started from a desire that I had to go to Brasilia,
Participar da Marcha das Mulheres Indígenas
to participate of the Indigenous Women March
e da Marcha das Margaridas.
and the Margaridas March.
Mulheres do Brasil todo e de fora vão até Brasília falar o que elas querem.
Women from all Brazil and abroad, they go to Brasilia to talk about what they want to stress.
Mas eu não tinha dinheiro para ir.
But I couldn't afford to do it.
E eu vi um edital de um site
I saw a selection of a grant in a website
que estava selecionando matérias
that was selecting articles
e dando uma bolsa.
and giving a grant.
E eu me inscrevi nesse edital junto com o Theo enquanto fotógrafo.
I applied with Theo as a photographer in this grant.
E o site Colabora investiu na ideia e me pediu para produzir 3 matérias.
And the website Colabora decided to invest in the idea and asked me to write 3 articles about it.
E aí eu comprei a passagem.
And then I bought the ticket.
O Theo foi no ônibus com as margaridas de Mato Grosso.
Theo went by bus.
E aí ele virou um margarido.
Theo went by bus with the other women in the march, and he became margarido.
E nós nos juntamos aos 2 movimentos.
And we worked together with the 2 movements.
E produzimos as pautas.
And made the topics.
Um procurador de Mato Grosso viu uma dessas pautas, que era a relacionada ao agrotóxico.
A judge in Brazil saw one of these articles that was related to pesticides.
E utilizou para abrir o procedimento solicitando a análise da água desses rios, porque são muitos rios.
And he used this article as the first step to open an inquiry investigating the quality of the water in many rivers.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria.
Unfortunately, Jasmine is on her way to the airport. and will be joining us tomorrow, but not in time for today. I'm going to play a video in which she talks about her work, and then we'll invite Karen and Phoebe up for a conversation.
Hi, everyone. It is, of course, also impossible to replace and be a stand-in for Jasmeen Patheja, but I thought it was really, really important to introduce her work that some of you may not be aware of. And I have the great pleasure to be doing this in conversation with Phoebe Tran, former student of mine, graduate of the New School, a educator, an artist, a writer, who graduated from the Food Studies program, has created a non-profit while she was still at the New School called the Happy Family Night Market. You are the author of a children's book, and it's just been really fantastic to follow your tracks a little bit during the New School and ever since you left. I invited Phoebe to be the interlocutor with Jasmeen because Jasmeen Patheja was actually the choice of the students in my class last fall. And while the vote was not completely unanimous, it almost was. And by far the majority of the students responded immediately and viscerally to this project. And just to explain, the students acted as judges for the prize. They received exactly the same material as the jury members, and went through various meetings, deliberations, looked at video documentation, images, the nominator statements, and the exactly same material, but chose Jasmeen Patheja. So Phoebe, could you even just begin speaking a little bit about why this project, Blank Noise, was so immediately attractive to you, and while it felt like the most important project of them all, something that needed to be seen in New York?
Sure. Hello. So I think that throughout the class, when we were learning a bit about how activism and art share a relationship, and how art practices might inflect, shift, and influence notions of justice. Jasmeen's work really resonated with myself and I think the rest of the class. I think, for one, as it took place around this time last year, it was largely relevant to the time in which the Me Too movement was going on in 2018. And Jasmeen's work also had similar movements, I Never Asked for It, and how she used technology to really connect people across India and Pakistan and even throughout the world. I think similarly, a lot of the class had resonated with the fact that this movement and this project was able to transcend culture and really gain collective meaning out of a personal experience that Jasmeen had said was what initially had inspired the project, and yet it was able to expand even outside of India. And yeah, I think that was my understanding of why the class and myself had nominated Jasmeen's project.
Blank Noise was founded by Jasmeen in 2003, so it's 15 years old, and she worked with very different strategies, and you were beginning to allude to them, social media, but also performance. And in this particular project called Meet to Sleep, she had her sheroes, the action heroes, heroines, spread out into a public park. I think that was in Bangalore, and restaged in other cities as well, and they occupied public space, lying down during the afternoon, taking a nap, and they were spaced from one another at equal distances, and that created kind of an aesthetic insertion into this park that was really, really striking. We obviously didn't see it, but she produced these fantastic photographs after it that are, I think one of them is shown here. Another project, particularly interesting and poignant, which is not done yet, is that she's asked these women that she's been working with for many, many years to bring in the pieces of clothing that provoked sexual assault or worse. And she has thousands of pieces of garment in her possession or in her storage, and is considering building some kind of arch, almost like a memorial arch to this crime against women. In her case, happening over 15 years. Then there is also this sense of humor in her work, and I wonder if you could maybe even speak a little bit maybe to the different strategies that she has applied. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess before going into this, the different strategies, I kind of wanted to touch on this project called Meet to Sleep, which I think was actually a point of controversy in our classroom because it raised questions of safety for women in India, where they were told to take a nap in public spaces, and I think that was sort of where people questioned, whether something had happened or what Jasmeen would do if she had instigated a project in which while she was responding to a risk of putting a woman's safety, she was also putting them at risk at the same time. However, I think that this risk-taking is also a form of activism in and of itself, and I think beyond just protesting or this other project she had, which was called Step by Step, Guide to Unapologetic Walking, in which her action heroes were told to walk in public spaces with confidence and boldness, looking up, not looking at the ground. I think this also goes into the strategies that she used. Going back to technology, she had a project called Reporting to Remember, which sort of serves as a living archive of sexual assault, in which it's sort of like an informal reporting platform for women to share their stories and narratives of being sexually assaulted. There was also a text message-based platform. I think she used WhatsApp, which was stated to be linked to a police reporting system. So I think it's interesting the fact that she was able to build community both on the ground and through these movements, but also just allowing women to have a voice, to really share their stories and create a sustained resonance throughout the project, because memories of sexual assault live and stay with people throughout their lives. And so I think that's definitely a powerful element of this project.
She's also worked with these women, for extended periods of time. So it's not just an invitation to the park and why don't you occupy a spot and fall asleep. So the collaborations consist of workshops and shared performances and writing and reading together. It's an in-depth relationship that is being built. And maybe in response to what the class said, she would have said something like, well, it's also an empowerment, that you take risks, but you also just have to claim that space with your body. But the cultural differences really are striking. I also thought just this TED talk was extraordinary. The guy who puts his hands in the face of the woman and says, I have the good fortune to do this to you now. It's really, it will take a long time.
Yeah, I think I wrote down something that was included in the nomination essay. In 2017, India ranked 125 of 129 countries in the Gender Inequality Index. Only 12.2% of parliament seats are held by women, and 26.8% of women above the age of 15 years are part of India's labor force, compared to 79.1% of men. So, being that India is still a largely patriarchal society, and that this project, within the context of our classroom, was being viewed and understood through the eyes of American first, second, or generation, or just American students. I think that because of its resonance taking place last year, it still maintained this this, like, I don't know, motive for everyone to want to vote for Jasmeen's project, because in and of itself, allowing for this project to be nominated for the award was an action and a mobility of the students to stand up for this cause against all of the other projects. While they were all incredible and well-deserving of the award, I think that I can't speak for everyone, but I think that in the context of a college classroom, there are still a lot of young women who are, figuring out how to have a voice and how to have a public dialogue around this very stigmatized topic.
It certainly seemed that was the project that was speaking most directly to very personal experiences or observations that the students had. Are there questions for Phoebe, or questions we can relay to Jasmeen tomorrow when she gets to town? Yes.
Thank you. I'm just curious what kinds of conversations there were amongst the students about their experiences here of what she was describing in Bangalore, such as abuse.
Right. Well, I think that in the project's nomination, it speaks a lot towards how religion, caste, and class influence how this project has this like cultural specificity. However, conversations that took place in class, I want to say that because sexual assault and harassment does not have to, it again transcends culture, and because of that, I think many of the women in class, and the class was actually largely women, except maybe two men. I think everyone just wanted to stand up for this cause, and I think that in New York specifically, for young women who might be here for the first time or are not used to being in such a public environment. I mean, I can speak from someone of East Asian descent, a perspective of someone from East Asian descent. There is a fetishization and tokenization of Asian identity in America that has, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, but it's prevalent in media, it's prevalent on a day-to-day basis. So I think it was a topic that everyone sort of could relate to at a very personal level, as Karen had mentioned, and yeah.
It's also a topic that you could take outside the classroom, and really bring immediately to, the next classroom or the university. I mean, it's very, very much part of the conversation at the university. Okay. Oh, there's one question in the back.
My question is, my name is Fatan from Palestine. I've worked a lot with the artists and art organizations, particularly in Palestine, Lebanon, and Egypt in the last 3 years. that work a lot with women, psychosocial support through the arts, women empowerment, and I've had the chance to do an external evaluation of 2 of these projects. And they tend sometimes to be a bit problematic because addressing women and harassment is important, and I think collectively as artists, many artists I work with in the region feel obliged to raise this issue, particularly that women's issues have always been pushed behind. For example, in the Palestinian struggle, the focus was on politics, not on women. Wait till we get our freedom, and then we can speak about women. Wait, refugees, Syrian refugees, until we have, and then we can speak about young women being married off and so on. And the same in Egypt. So the problem is that many of the artists that I've worked with the best of intentions, they tend to raise issues and concerns in women that they cannot necessarily attend to long term. I've been always, in the last 3 years, haunted by this question: is how far do we go as practitioners and artists who are not necessarily trained to work with the women, women who are suffering. I've met with women who've been subjected to sexual trafficking in Cairo, women who've been sexually and physically abused by their spouses for years. And it felt that although artist work is important and essential, but it has to come within a bigger context of not leaving these women alone as well, because there's something that goes beyond in terms of their healing and recovery. So I'm always having this question is, what's the mandate of the art in these processes? Perhaps coalitions, bigger coalitions with social, mental health institutes. So, because it's always that at a certain point the women feel abandoned, from my experience. They start addressing their issues, and at a certain point, artists move on with their projects, and the women feel abandoned. So.
Okay, so it's maybe important to clarify that my understanding of Jasmeen's practice is really one of awareness raising. And when I mentioned earlier humor may have been a little, unexpected, there is a very tender and loving and also quite forgiving gesture of including everyone. For instance, with this project of when she engages men in conversations, and one-on-one conversations, I forgot the title of it, but yeah, that's the one. And they're kind of gentle invitations to begin to understand how a woman might feel. So the main thrust of the project is not necessarily, I believe, to facilitate or to achieve closure or healing, but to, at the very least, begin to make this part of a public discourse. And that's where she uses these various media, social media and so on. She has chapters in many different cities. She does work with local agencies. Yeah. So it's also advocacy work. Definitely, yeah. Does that?
Yeah,
resonate?
I mean, I similarly had questions for Jasmeen that I had prepared as well that was asking specifically about how works like Reporting to Remember or these text message-based reporting platforms really led to political justice for these victims of sexual assault. So perhaps the conversation has not ended here until Jasmeen has arrived.
Yeah. Okay. On that note, thank you all very much.